The committee will come to order. I want to first off thank each of our witnesses for being here today and for your service to our nation each and every day. You have extremely challenging jobs to ensure that government is working effectively and efficiently for the American people. I look forward to hearing from each of you on how this committee can ensure the independence and the integrity of inspectors general as you continue this work. As current federal watchdogs, your perspective will be critical in helping us finalize legislation that will provide you and your colleagues with protections to strengthen independent oversight of the government's effectiveness. This legislation is, quite frankly, long overdue. For decades, inspectors general have acted as independent, nonpartisan watchdogs tasked with helping Congress prevent and uncover fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government and ensure taxpayer dollars are being used appropriately. The Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency's recent annual report to Congress estimated that inspectors general saved American taxpayers more than $50 billion last year alone. It's absolutely vital that our federal watchdogs are able to work independently and without the threat of political interference. Current law allows for actions that threaten to undermine this independence, including the removal of inspectors general from office without sufficient explanation and the appointment of partisan political operatives to serve in these traditionally nonpartisan roles. These actions and others have left inspectors general and their critical work vulnerable to political influence, and that is simply unacceptable. We must ensure that no administration is able to undercut the independent transparency and accountability that inspectors general provide to the American people. That's why Ranking Member Portman and I are working together to enact the first significant reforms to support inspectors general in more than 13 years. I'm proud our bipartisan, bicameral effort enjoys broad support from our colleagues in numerous good government groups. I'm grateful to Senators Grassley and Hessen, as well as House Oversight Chairwoman Maloney, for helping us create these reforms, which will require a more detailed explanation from the President before removing an Inspector General. Ensure that acting Inspectors General are selected from a pool of senior-level employees within the watchdog community, and provide federal watchdogs the authority to subpoena the testimony of contractors and former federal officials. Through these common sense solutions, this committee has the opportunity to consider and advance historic, meaningful reforms that strengthen our democracy and promote independent oversight, a goal that I know we all share. I look forward to discussing how we can best protect our inspectors general and swiftly pass these urgently needed reforms. My ranking member is en route. He'll be here shortly, so I will swear in the witnesses now. It is the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you will each rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Our first witness, Allison Lerner, is the Inspector General of the National Science Foundation and Chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. In her role, she recommends policies and leads efforts to prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse, improves the integrity of the National Science Foundation programs and operations, and investigates allegations of misconduct in science. Ms. Lerner has 30 years of federal experience, initially starting her career in the Office of Inspector General of Commerce as Assistant Counsel. In 2011, she was designated by President Obama as a member of the Government Accountability and Transparency Board. Welcome, Ms. Lerner, but before we hear your opening comments, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Portman for his opening comments.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your indulgence, and thank you for convening this hearing today. Inspectors General are essential to good government. I think everybody understands and agrees with that. Congress has a responsibility, of course, to conduct oversight of the executive branch, and that responsibility would be far more difficult without inspectors general. They're inside the agencies. They oversee. They have unique expertise in their agency's programs and budgets, and I really think they're Congress's first line of defense against waste, fraud, and abuse at those agencies. According to the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, or CIGI, and we'll hear from CIGI today, in fiscal year 2020 alone, IG's work resulted in potential savings totaling $53 billion. That's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. We ask IGs to undertake some of the most important and sensitive oversight work. For example, I intend to offer an amendment today to our IG legislation we will consider next week to require the appropriate IGs to review the administration's Afghan vetting policy. This review would include multiple agencies, complex programs, and evolving information. I think IGs are the best place to do that. They're best positioned to conduct this type of nonpartisan expert review needed to understand an important issue. This committee is responsible for protecting IG independence and providing them with the authorities to do that kind of important work. Since 1978, Congress has improved and reformed Inspector General authorities many times. This includes legislation to establish a total of 73 IGs across the federal government, bolster IG's access to information, and, of course, to protect whistleblowers. These reforms represent steps in the right direction, but we think more work is still needed. I requested today's hearing so the committee can discuss this IG legislation Senator Peters and I plan to consider at next week's business meeting. And I want the Chairman to know I appreciate the fact that you've accommodated that request. I think this will be positive for our legislation and for a general discussion about the importance of IGs. As noted, we've got three very important members of the IG community in front of us here today: Department of Justice IG and former CIGI Chair Michael Horowitz, who all of us know, National Science Foundation IG and current CIGI Chair Allison Lerner, and Amtrak IG and CIGI Integrity Committee Chair Kevin Winters. To start, the legislation that we are going to be talking about provides much-needed protections for Inspector General independence. Many have worked on this, including Senator Grassley. We should notice his work. I will point out that the current law already requires the President to provide Congress a 30 days notice before removing an IG. We don't change that. It does not increase the time period. It does, however, preserve the congressional intent and the interest in understanding why that IG was removed by requiring the President to provide a substantive rationale for removing an IG. Both President Obama and President Trump removed IGs and told Congress they had lost confidence in the removed IG. I don't think we should be satisfied with such a statement, no matter the party of the President. The legislation also remedies another problem that occurred during the Obama and Trump administrations by requiring that acting IGs be named from the Inspector General community. Both President Obama and President Trump named agency officials as acting IGs, raising questions about the independence of those IGs. An agency official cannot conduct independent oversight of his or her own agencies and actions. Putting an agency official in charge of its IG office also risks exposing whistleblowers and could chill future reports of waste, fraud, and abuse. The legislation also provides testimonial subpoena authority for IGs. This will allow IGs to complete interviews of important witnesses, even if a person has resigned, to avoid participating in an investigation. And unfortunately, that has been a common occurrence within our system, according to IGs. Subpoena authority is a weighty responsibility, though, which is why I've worked with Senator Peters to ensure the bill does provide effective guardrails and effective reporting to Congress. Additionally, the bill incentivizes filling IG vacancies. Installing permanent IGs is important. They provide more independence and continuity than acting IGs. This May, I sent a letter to President Biden with the Chairman and many of this committee's members urging him to fill the 13 vacant Senate-confirmed IG positions. I'm pleased to see that the President has taken our advice seriously and nominated individuals to fill a number of those vacancies. But all those vacancies need to be filled. Finally, the legislation provides measures to improve oversight of the IGs themselves, such as requiring that CIGI report to Congress when it becomes aware of a particularly serious problem at an IG office. I know all three of these distinguished witnesses have much to give us today in terms of their input. They've given this a lot of thought. They understand the need for these proposals for change. I thank each of them for their service and for taking the time to appear before us today, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Ms. Lerner, you may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today in my role as chairperson of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, or CIGI. Despite the tumult caused by the pandemic, our community has remained focused on its vital mission, providing impartial and nonpartisan oversight and transparency into some of the most difficult problems are facing the agencies we oversee. Altogether, our work in 2020, as has been noted, resulted in potential savings totaling approximately $53 billion, a $17 return on every dollar invested in IG oversight. For accomplishments like this to continue and expand, action is necessary. Each Congress, the CIGI Legislation Committee presents the community's critical reform proposals to strengthen government oversight or resolve challenges that IGs face under current law. This session, our legislative priorities strongly focus on enhancing Inspector General independence, the institutional independence of OIGs, and enhancing OIG oversight. Today, I want to highlight some of these initiatives, which are part of H.R. 2662 and included in the Peters-Portman substitute amendment. First, as I noted, it's imperative that Congress take steps to protect the institutional independence of Inspectors General. To be effective, IGs have to be independent in both mind and appearance. And being independent is no less important for individuals temporarily serving as head of an OIG. The IG community urges Congress to amend the Federal Vacancies Reform Act to prevent the appointment of an acting IG that calls into question the independence of the office. Currently, a president can fill a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed IG vacancy with a political appointee or a senior official from the agency the IG oversees. Such appointments, which have occurred under both Democratic and Republican administrations, create actual and perceived conflicts of interest that undermine the IG's independence and stakeholders' confidence in its work, discourage whistleblowers from coming to the IG with evidence of fraud, waste, and abuse, and create a disincentive for the president to appoint a permanent IG. The proposed change would have the first assistant of the Inspector General serve during a vacancy, but allow the president to designate another IG or senior OIG official to fill the vacancy. This reform would provide an acting IG with the independence necessary to maintain the public's trust and widen the pool of professional oversight officials the president may direct to serve as an acting IG. This legislation, together with an additional provision requiring notification to Congress when an IG is placed on non-duty status, will greatly improve IG independence. We appreciate that these safeguards are part of the Peters-Portman substitute amendment. Second, Congress must strengthen oversight tools available to OIGs. The IG community, with bipartisan support from this committee since at least 2015, has long sought testimonial subpoena authority, an essential tool for IGs to be able to conduct comprehensive oversight. Because most IGs lack this authority, they cannot obtain potentially critical evidence related to alleged wrongdoing from certain individuals unless they voluntarily agree to be interviewed. The fact that we cannot require these interviews undermines our ability to complete investigations and hold individuals accountable for their misconduct, thereby diminishing the public's trust in government. We're committed to providing technical assistance to develop controls to ensure that the effective and appropriate use of this new authority. We want to express our appreciation to Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman, as well as Senators Grassley and Hassan, for including this authority in the substitute amendment and otherwise working diligently with the IG community on this needed authority. Finally, we also support the committee and members' efforts to reform OIG semi-annual reports by leveraging public information and resources such as oversight.gov, requiring OIG employees to be informed about their whistleblower rights and protections, making needed change to support CIGI's Integrity Committee, and replacing the current indirect process for funding CIGI with a direct authorization of an appropriation that affords transparency but does not require additional funding from taxpayers. In closing, I'd like to thank all members and staff of this committee for your strong bipartisan support for our community and for the seriousness with which you take our mission. I look forward to working closely with you all to ensure that Inspectors General continue to be empowered to provide the independent, nonpartisan oversight our agencies, Congress, and the American public so richly deserve. This concludes my statement, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lerner. Our next witness is Kevin Winters, Inspector General of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation and Integrity Committee Chair, Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency. Mr. Winters brings a wealth of experience, formerly serving as a senior executive with NASA's Office of Inspector General from 2005 through 2015. As NASA's Assistant Inspector General for Investigations, his staff of special agents, investigative auditors, and computer forensic examiners focused on allegations of fraud, waste, and abuse affecting NASA's programs. Mr. Winters also served in the United States Marine Corps, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. Subsequently, he held several domestic and overseas assignments, including duties as a prosecutor and defense counsel. Welcome, Mr. Winters, and thank you for your service. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the important work of CIGI's Integrity Committee. As you mentioned, I currently serve as Amtrak's Inspector General, and I've been a member of the IG community for the past 15 years. And to include, as you said, service as NASA as the Assistant Inspector General for Investigations. In 2019, the then CIGI Chair, Michael Horowitz, appointed me to be an IC member. In 2020, the IC membership elected me to serve as a chairperson for a 2-year term. My testimony today will focus on 3 topics. First, an overview of the IC's mission and structure. IC is short for the Integrity Committee, by the way. Second, an insight into our workload, recognizing that we cannot discuss ongoing matters. And third, our challenges, which present opportunities for improvement. By law, IGs have daunting oversight responsibilities over agencies' programs and operations. Amtrak's, for example, includes a 24/7 nationwide rail service to 46 states and 3 Canadian provinces and employs 17,000 people. As their IG, Congress entrusted me with a tremendous oversight resources, such as powers to audit, to investigate, unfettered access to information, subpoena power, and law enforcement authority. These tremendous powers, by the way, are typical of IGs across the federal IG community. To check this tremendous power, Congress, in my view, wisely established the Integrity Committee to ensure that senior IG officials, currently about 468 of them, perform their duties with integrity and apply the same standards of conduct and accountability to themselves as they apply to the agencies that they audit and investigate. The IC's mission, therefore, is to receive, review, and refer for investigations allegations of wrongdoing made against an Inspector General or certain senior members of an IG's office. By statute, the Integrity Committee is composed of 6 members. 4 are serving IGs. 2 are presidentially appointed. The other 2 are from designated federal entities. There are 2 other voting members, a senior officials from the FBI and the director of the Office of Government Ethics or designee. And there is a small CIGI staff, primarily lawyers, to assist the Integrity Committee, and the Public Integrity section of the Department of Justice also serves as a legal advisor. This self-policing of the IG community is a solemn responsibility that requires the Integrity Committee to be vigilant, independent, objective, nonpartisan, and appropriately transparent to maintain the trust of our key stakeholders, which are the public, Congress, whistleblowers and witnesses, and those within our investigative jurisdiction. And while there is always room for improvement, the Integrity Committee and its support staff work diligently to uphold this serious responsibility. Fiscal year 2021 saw a dramatic jump in communications to the Integrity Committee. In 2020, for example, we received 1,152. This year, 3,917. We also saw an increase in complexity and severity of the incoming complaints. We met 19 times in FY 2021, opened 65 cases for review, which involved 30 different agencies. We completed 3 investigations, which were submitted then to appropriate for appropriate action to appointing authorities in relevant congressional committees. We also initiated 4 investigations. As of this hearing, the IC has 9 investigations pending completion. As someone who has spent my professional life in service to our country, both in peace and war, I recognize how fortunate we are to have a system of government built on adherence to the rule of law and with checks and balances, which includes independent inspectors general who help ensure the effectiveness of their agencies. I support H.R. 2662. I am thankful for your interest in the efforts of the Integrity Committee to serve as a credible and trusted check on the tremendous powers entrusted to senior members of the IG community. And I look forward to your questions, recognizing, of course, that we cannot discuss ongoing and open matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winters. Our final witness is Michael Horowitz, Inspector General for the Department of Justice. In his role, Mr. Horowitz oversees a nationwide workforce of more than 500 special agents, auditors, inspectors, attorneys, and support staff whose mission is to detect and deter waste, fraud, and abuse. He also serves as the chair of the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, SIGI, an organization comprised of all 75 federal inspector generals. Since the start of the pandemic, he has simultaneously led the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, a committee of 22 federal inspectors general that oversees the federal pandemic-related emergency spending. Mr. Horowitz, good to see you again. You may proceed with your opening.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Good to be here again, and thank you, Ranking Member Portman and members of the committee. Each year, as was noted, independent oversight work by IGs results in billions of dollars in recoveries and savings for the taxpayers. The bipartisan Inspector General Independence and Empowerment Act of 2021 will allow the IG community to build on that success and further protect the public we serve from waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. I want to address 2 provisions that are particularly important to my office at the DOJ. Expanding my office's jurisdiction to include professional misconduct by DOJ attorneys, and providing IGs with testimonial subpoena authority. Granting my office authority to investigate alleged professional misconduct by DOJ attorneys has received broad, bipartisan support over successive Congresses because it promotes independent oversight, transparency, and accountability within DOJ for all of its employees, including department prosecutors. I'm the only Inspector General in the federal government that does not have the authority to investigate all alleged misconduct, including professional misconduct, by agency attorneys. There's no principled basis, in my view, for granting my office oversight over DOJ law enforcement personnel, such as FBI agents, while excluding DOJ lawyers from that same OIG oversight. Providing my office with such jurisdiction would enhance the public's confidence in the outcomes of these investigations and provide the OIG with the same authority as every other IG. The importance of a statutorily independent office within DOJ to oversee allegations of misconduct by DOJ lawyers was even recognized recently by the National Association of Assistant U.S. Attorneys in a recent opinion piece. While that organization disagreed with me that such oversight should be done by my office and instead proposed that the head of the department's Office of Professional Responsibility become a Senate-confirmed position, we both agree that independence is necessary to promote public confidence in investigations of department lawyers. Congress has already created such a statutorily independent entity within DOJ that has a demonstrated ability to conduct such oversight, namely the DOJ OIG. We employ dozens of attorneys whose backgrounds and experiences are similar to the lawyers in the DOJ OPR, including former prosecutors and department attorneys specializing in attorney ethics. This group of my attorneys at the Department of Justice, OIG, led our review of the FISA abuse allegations, the Clinton email and Comey memos investigations, and our overview of ATF's Operation Fast and Furious, as well as other sensitive and complex matters. Further, the OIG would ensure that the process for reviewing attorney misconduct allegations is identical to the OIG system that currently exists across the Department of Justice for non-attorney misconduct allegations. For decades, the OIG has coordinated effectively with the DOJ law enforcement components. Indeed, the disciplinary processes at the FBI and DEA have substantially improved since the OIG obtained oversight authority over those components in 2002. These same transparency and accountability mechanisms should apply to DOJ attorneys, and that's why I believe the public would be well served by adopting this legislative change. Let me turn briefly to testimonial subpoena authority, which I also strongly support. The absence of such authority hinders our ability to potentially obtain critical evidence from former employees, employees of federal contractors and grant recipients, and other non-government witnesses in investigations involving fraud, waste, abuse, and misconduct. Recently, Congress granted this authority to SIGI's Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, as it had previously done with the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board in 2009. Further, the DoD IG was granted this authority by Congress in 2009, and it has used it appropriately and sparingly. My office has numerous examples in high-profile and not-so-high-profile investigations and reviews where the lack of such authority has undermined our oversight efforts. For example, in our recent review of the FBI's handling of the Nassar investigation, the USA Gymnastics former president refused a voluntary follow-up interview with my office after we had learned additional information about an alleged potential conflict of interest involving a former FBI special agent in charge. This inability in numerous cases to hold accountable former officials for serious misconduct diminishes the public's trust in the government and harms the taxpayers. Importantly, your legislation includes several appropriate and important safeguards which I fully support, including allowing the Attorney General an opportunity to object to the issuance of a subpoena and an IG panel to oversee the issuance of such subpoenas. I hope the committee moves this legislation forward. In conclusion, thank you for your leadership and this committee's leadership in supporting our independent oversight efforts, and I look forward to the committee's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. The Inspector General independence clearly is vital to our democracy, and Congress must take every effort to ensure your independence is not undermined. That includes providing oversight when an IG is removed from office. Legislation that we're working on with Ranking Member Portman includes an enhanced 30-day notification requirement for the President to provide a detailed reason for removing an IG, which gives Congress the time to deliberate whether the removal is appropriate and warranted. Ms. Lerner, I know you mentioned this in your opening comments. If you'd like to elaborate, we'd love to hear, and then I'd love to hear from the other two witnesses on your thoughts on this requirement. Ms. Lerner?
Thank you. We appreciate the proposed amendment and the greater clarity that would come from a more in-depth statement than the simple fact that a president has lost confidence in an IG. As you note, that gives Congress in particular greater insight and makes it much more likely that they'll be able to conduct appropriate oversight. We hope that it will also prevent situations where IGs are removed for purely political reasons when it is clear that the president has to articulate a legitimate reason for that removal. And this also bolsters, we believe, these reporting requirements, the notice requirements that already exist that relate to removing an Inspector General. I'll turn over.
Thank you. Mr. Winters, your thoughts?
I agree with Ms. Lerner's assessment.
Mr. Horowitz?
Mr. Chairman, the enhanced requirement, because IG positions are different, the need for independence allows Congress to better understand the reasons for the removal, but most importantly, frankly, allows the public to understand the reasons for the removal. We're there to protect the public and the public fisc and the taxpayers, and so they should know the real reason and the actual reason why an IG was removed.
Thank you. I'm going to start this next question for Mr. Winters, but I want to hear from our other two witnesses as well. Under current federal vacancy law, nothing prevents the president from appointing an acting IG who isn't qualified or who has a conflict of interest. In the event of a vacancy, why is it important to limit who can serve as an acting IG to individuals who already serve in the IG community? Mr. Winters?
Yeah, from my perspective, it gets down to independence and competence in doing federal oversight work. To take someone from the IG community to serve in that role, I think, is a real benefit to the nation and the agency, rather than, for example, someone who comes with a political perspective from their own agency.
Mr. Horowitz?
Mr. Chairman, the GAO issued a report last year, and the Comptroller General spoke to this problem, which is the inherent clear conflict that exists. It's wholly inconsistent with the IG Act, I think, as you and Ranking Member Portman indicated, to have overseeing the agency and a senior official from that agency, whether they're a political appointee or not. There can't be that level of confidence and trust from the public that it's truly independent oversight, and it also creates issues for whistleblowers. Why would a whistleblower go to an agency to complain about senior officials' misconduct if they knew that IG office was overseen by a senior official who would know their identity? And, of course, as we've seen as IGs, the threat of retaliation, the fear of retaliation is with good reason, because we've seen whistleblowers retaliate against.
Thank you. Ms. Lerner?
The IG Act requires that inspectors general be appointed without regard to political affiliation and based solely on integrity and their demonstrated excellence in certain specific disciplines. And that's important because IGs are in their positions to lead independent and objective units focused on the IG's twofold mission of preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse, and promoting an economy and efficiency. The purpose of those requirements is completely undermined if an acting IG who is either a political appointee or in the agency being overseen is asked to run an Inspector General's office.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, you cited the OIG's lack of testimonial subpoena authority as a reason why individuals with potentially relevant information to an investigation were able to ignore questions from the office. You cited the example of the Nassar example, which unfortunately I'm all too familiar with, being from the state of Michigan. Mr. Horowitz, how would testimonial subpoena authority improve the work of the Inspector General?
I think it'd be an extremely important change and helpful to us in a wide range of our work. It's easy for me. I can cite example after example in our high-profile cases, but it happens very frequently in our not-so-high-profile cases where individuals simply refuse to appear, or we've had occasions where people have resigned a few hours before a compelled interview, precisely because they want to avoid speaking to us. We've had 2 examples like that in just the last couple of years. Whistleblower cases, we've had it both within FBI, where a former senior official wouldn't speak to us about alleged retaliation, and we had it with a contractor, where a contractor claimed that their employer, contractee had claimed that their employer had ripped off the Marshal Service. We tried to speak to their supervisor, who had left the contractor. We couldn't. Those are the kind of problems we face.
Ms. Lerner, you testified that Inspector General oversight can be substantially hampered by the inability to compel the testimony of witnesses who have information that cannot be obtained by any other means. A few agency IGs, including the DOD IG, already have testimonial subpoena authority, and at least as I understand it, that power has so far been used judiciously and sparingly, and simply having the authority means the IGs often rarely have to use it. How can we ensure that testimonial subpoena authority isn't abused?
I think at a minimum, we start by applying the same standards we use for our documentary subpoenas, and we build on that. In my office, for a documentary subpoena to be issued, there are 6 sets of eyes that go on it: 3 investigators, 2 attorneys, and then me. And our focus and attention has added a great deal of value there. And in the 30 years of our existence, we've never had a subpoena enforced. We're not alone. Other IGs have this, so we build on those procedures. We add additional controls that are appropriate for the stepped-up risk associated with testimonial subpoena authority. And then obviously we comply with the additional controls that you all are considering that would require notice to the Attorney General's and transparency about the use of this authority through IG semi-annual reports and reporting from SIGI. So we are committed to working with you all to ensure that those protections are in place.
Mr. Chairman, may I add something on testimonial subpoena?
Absolutely.
From the Integrity Committee's perspective, where we have oversight over senior Inspector General personnel, to include Inspector Generals, this would be a great tool for us as well, because like Michael Horowitz testified, we have individuals that leave government, but we have the authority and the public interest to investigate them even after they leave. But if they refuse to testify or to answer our calls, then our investigations are somewhat pointless. And to Ms. Lerner's point, in terms of how is the TSA checked? The Integrity Committee serves as a check on abuses of testimonial subpoena authority as well.
Right. Thank you. We're in the midst of votes, is why you're seeing members come and go. So I need to devote myself. I will turn the chair gavel over to Senator Hessen and recognize Ranking Member Portman for his questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you all for being here and for the testimony you've already provided. It's very, very helpful. The 30-day notice period and the provisions that we want to include within that so that there's some rationale that Congress and the American people can understand, really important. The testimonial subpoena, we put guardrails in place for a reason, because we think this is a power that could be abused. We want to make sure it's not. In that area, there is some discussion of putting a sunset on it. I understand if it's a sunset that is very short, that it would be hard for it to work operationally. It takes a while to get this process up and going. But what about a sunset of 4 or 5 or 6 years for the testimonial subpoenas? How would you feel about that? Anyone feel free to chime in.
I'll start. Our strong preference, Congress always has the ability to revoke an authority that it's granted. Our concern with the sunset provision is that it's a blunt instrument. Our preference would be to have a requirement to have the use of these authorities reviewed by an independent entity like SIGI or GAO, and allow the results of that review to inform Congress's decision about whether to continue or to revoke this authority. But if a sunset date is necessary, and we understand that that's important for some members, we would ask that the period be long enough to enable us to have sufficient numbers of examples to make the case for the use of the authority. Since in many instances, the mere fact that a testimonial subpoena authority could be issued is enough to ensure an individual's compliance with an interview. So we would, we would prefer, a 10-year period before sunsetting, and then that's in no small part because of the amount of time that it's taken us to obtain this authority in the first place. Okay. It's taken us 10 years with congressional support to get this far, and we're worried that we could, with a hard and fast sunset, lose that authority and have great difficulty getting it reauthorized.
Well, I do think it's important also the guardrails we've placed on it, and we'll have further discussions about that, because I think this is an important issue for us to try to resolve today as we go into markup in the next couple of weeks in this legislation. It's incredibly important that you all have independence. And, we rely on you to conduct some of the most sensitive and important investigations in government, because we believe you are uniquely qualified to be able to do it. I mentioned earlier you've got the expertise. You've also got the nonpartisanship, and IGs need to be beyond reproach. I'm going to ask a few questions about one such sensitive and important investigation by your office, Mr. Horowitz. And this is a sensitive topic, I know, but I think it's one that's important for us to talk about today as we have the leadership of the IG community before us. That's about the investigation of former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. Mr. McCabe, as you know, was fired for lacking candor under oath in 2018, shortly before his retirement. Late last week, DOJ reversed course, settling a lawsuit by Mr. McCabe to restore his employment as a voluntary separation and to restore his pension. Mr. Horowitz, could you briefly remind us of the findings of your report regarding Mr. McCabe?
Certainly, Senator. The report concerned an investigation that actually the FBI had initially undertaken involving alleged leaks about information that was potentially damaging to Secretary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign. The FBI internal investigators developed information that they believed led them to believe that Deputy Director McCabe may have lied to them. They then referred the matter to us, given the position he held at the FBI. We assumed the investigation and concluded in a public report that remains on our website and the public can see that Mr. McCabe lied both under oath and not under oath on several occasions when he denied at various points certain key facts and information, including who was the source of the leak.
Okay. It's my understanding that following that report, which sounds like it was a pretty definitive report, the top career official at the Department of Justice, as well as the career head of the Office of Professional Management or Professional Responsibility at DOJ, both recommended that Mr. McCabe be fired. Is that correct?
That's certainly correct, I know, as to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility head, who, as you indicated, is a career employee and actually is a former prosecutor. They adjudicate, in the first instance, our findings, so our report goes to them. They decide whether they agree with us. They agreed with us on almost all, but actually not all, of our findings, so they made their own independent call that, in fact, he lied on multiple occasions, but they didn't fully find everything we found. They then sent it to, because of Deputy Director McCabe's position, there's a different process for him. It went to the Attorney General for review, then Attorney General Sessions. And my understanding is, and this I don't have complete insight to, but my understanding is that the Attorney General asked a career official in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General to handle the review, and that person recommended removal as well.
So the senior career person agreed with your finding that the removal was appropriate?
That's my understanding.
Should be a firing. Is that consistent with how the Department of Justice and the Office of Professional Responsibility has handled these sorts of cases in the past?
That's my understanding as well.
Okay. And was your report influenced by President Trump or anyone in the Trump administration, any political considerations?
Absolutely none.
And did the settlement change any of the findings in your report?
It did not. We actually were not sued by Mr. McCabe. The lawsuit, so we were not a party to the settlement. Our findings remain on our website. We stand by our findings. The public can read them. They can go to our website. And by the way, the FBI issued a statement stating that they stand by their findings as well of their OPR and their conclusions.
So how did this happen? And what kind of message does this send to FBI agents that a former deputy director was not held accountable for misrepresenting facts under oath?
Well, look, I think as an IG that it's critical that individuals be held accountable for their wrongdoing no matter what level they're at an organization, and that it's particularly incumbent upon us to hold accountable senior officials at the same way we hold accountable less senior officials and newer officials.
You view this as a double standard, Mr. Horowitz?
I can't speak to, Senator, the decision of the department and what evidence they saw on the adjudication, so I'm not going to speak specifically to why they settled or how they settled, because I was not a party to that settlement. But it's very important, and this is why I think the FBI issued their statement as well. It's very important for employees to understand that we will hold them at the OIG accountable regardless of their position or standing.
Mr. Horowitz, you were appointed by President Obama. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How important is your independence as an IG to your ability to make comments like the ones you just made today?
It's central to what we do. You know, we can't, in other countries, people in my position can't do that for fear of being fired, removed, or frankly, even things worse happening. I have an opportunity to meet as SIGI chair, or had an opportunity to meet as SIGI chair, with delegations from foreign countries. And it struck me how many times those officials wanted to know what we did and how we did it, because in their countries, they might get killed if they did the same kind of work we do.
Well, this just goes, my time has expired, but it goes to the importance of the testimony you all are providing today, the legislation we're considering, and the interest in maintaining the independence of the IGs in our system of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Portman. Senator Carper, are you available? I see you pulling up your chair. Senator Carper is joining us virtually. Senator Carper, are you ready to be recognized? I think he's coming. Senator Carper, you're recognized for your questions if you're ready.
Am ready. But I asked a question first question pertains to our legislation that Senator Braun and I introduced called the Keep the Watchdogs Running Act. Isn't that pretty good? That's a good title, isn't it? But the legislation would give the offices of the Inspector General authority to continue oversight of agency operations in the event of a government shutdown. To the extent that certain agencies continue to operate. The idea is we have a government shutdown. Somewhere down the line, there's going to be some agencies that won't shut down, will continue to operate, and we want to make sure that the Inspector Generals keep operating too, to keep an eye on things there. Mr. Horowitz, nice to see you again. Ms. Lerner, Mr. Winters, can each of you take a moment to discuss the importance, please, of ensuring that essential oversight work continues even during a government shutdown? As much as we hope we never have another one, we probably will. So that's my question, and it pertains to our legislation, bipartisan legislation that Senator Braun and I have introduced. Go ahead. Mr. Horowitz, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Senator, and happy to do so. And I agree with you completely about the importance of keeping running while even in the event of a government shutdown. We've been appreciative of the fact that our appropriators on the CGS subcommittee have given us authority to carry over up to $4 million in funding, and that in part helps us continue running if there is a government shutdown. But of course, it's a very limited period of time that it would allow us to continue operations. When the government shuts down, the grants that were given out, the contracts that were given out by the government, all of that work continues, or at least all of those monies continue to flow at the Justice Department. Agents continue to work. Lawyers continue to work, assuming the courts are not shut down. And there's oversight work to be done. And it shouldn't be the case that the overseers are shut down while the money continues to flow. So I think it's very important that we be able to continue our work.
Thanks, Mike. Same question, if I could, for Ms. Lerner. Ms. Lerner and Mr. Winters, just very briefly, your comments, please.
What I would just note, expanding on what Mr. Horowitz indicated, is it's wonderful that IGs have independent appropriations, but a downside of that is it limits our ability to continue working in a shutdown situation. Like him, I'm lucky enough to have some carryover funding, and that could enable me to keep my folks working for about a week. But my agency, with its many different appropriations, has much greater flexibility and latitude to keep staff working potentially, and we would not be able to oversee them. And I know we are not alone at NSF-OIG in that situation. So this authority would be of value, not just to us, but to the whole IG community in situations where we face a government shutdown.
Excellent. Thanks, Ms. Lerner.
And just very briefly, from Amtrak's perspective, the trains continue to run during a government shutdown. And as you've seen in the newspapers, this is a very important national function to run a railroad, but there's safety considerations at bay. So to shut down an office of Inspector General while the trains are running is inconsistent, in my view, with good government.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Thank you, sir. As a frequent rider of Amtrak, I'd say that. To be a question for Ms. Winters with you on this. You could be our lead off hitter. But the Inspector General's Act of I think it was 1978 established the offices of Inspector Generals at 12 federal agencies. Describes those offices as the quote, I think out of law, independent and objective units that are charged with investigating waste, investigating fraud, abuse, and promoting such much needed accountability. As this commander, as this committee, as a former commander of the Navy, as this committee considers legislative reforms to the IG Act that would strengthen the independence and integrity of the Inspectors General across federal government, could each of you share what you believe is the most important reform that we in the Congress may want to consider, given lessons learned under previous administrations? Most important reform that we in Congress may want to consider. And Mr. Winters, why don't you lead us off, please?
What was it, Lerner or me? Oh, in terms of the present bill, the reforms in there, I think the vacancies and the replacement of IGs that are leaving government from pick a reason, but for example, if the president removes an IG, I think that is a critical juncture in terms of making sure that there's appropriate reform to ensure that the next IG going in is truly independent. The other matters in the bill are equally important, but that's the one, to me, that strikes me as the most important.
Great, thank you, sir. Ms. Lerner, what would you say is maybe the most important provision?
I have to double down on Mr. Winter's statement about the importance of ensuring that acting IGs have the independence that they need to do their work. When you look at the length of the number of vacancies that we've had over the last 5 years and the lengths of those vacancies, you find acting officials in position for years. And so it's essential, if the work of the office is to continue and to provide value to Congress and the American public, that you have someone who can lead that work and whose independence will not be questioned.
Right, thanks, Ms. Lerner. Mr. Horowitz, same question, most important reform that we in the Congress may want to consider in this regard. Take it away.
Thank you, Senator. I think the Vacancies Act piece is the most important for the reasons previously indicated by Mr. Winters and Ms. Lerner. I'll just add on the Testimonial Subpoena Authority. I think that's critical from the public standpoint in particular. I think it's very hard to be in a position where we're being asked to investigate alleged wrongdoing, like occurred in, for example, the Nassar matter. And then when the public wants to know the answer to what happened, we unfortunately often have to give the answer, we're not sure. We don't know because the employee has left, quit, the contractor who's allegedly retaliated won't talk to us. That leaves significant dissatisfaction and creates a question for the public about the value of our work if we can't answer the most basic questions because we can't get the evidence we need.
Good. Is it Madam Chair? I'm not sure who's chairing right now.
I'm chairing, Senator, so thank you.
Can I just, I have one short question, but I'd just like to ask them to answer it on the record, but I'd like, if I could, to take 20 seconds and just.
All right, take 20 seconds and then we'll move on.
According to the Council of Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, 14 Inspector General positions remain vacant. 14 of these President Biden has nominated 8. Could each of you please, for the record, take some time to discuss ways to incentivize well-qualified individuals to consider serving as IGs? Additionally, what do you believe are the essential characteristics of an effective Inspector General? For the record, please. Thank you all. Thanks for all that each of you do.
And why don't we start with Ms. Lerner and we'll just go right down the line.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
I had difficulty hearing it too. Senator Carper, could I suggest that you submit that for the record and that...
That's what I asked to do.
Oh, you're just submitting that question for the record. You're not asking them to answer.
That's exactly right.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And now, Senator Johnson, if you are ready. Senator Johnson, if you're ready, I'll recognize you for your round of questions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for your service. Inspector General Horowitz, you and I have had this conversation before where I've made the analogy, which I think is a pretty accurate analogy, to independent auditors that are appointed by the board, oftentimes selected by the CEO, and they are meant to provide information to the board of directors who report to the shareholders. You know, is everything on the up and up in the corporation? So, you know, I kind of look at Inspector Generals the exact same way. And when I hear independent, you know, I'm just asking the question: independent of who? Who should Inspector Generals be independent of?
So, yeah, and we've had this discussion, and I appreciate it. And as you know from our discussion, I've, in private practice, represented and worked with audit committees and independent auditors. And I think the answer on that is independent of the agency leadership from being able to take personnel action against them. That's the system Congress set up. And now I'm going to talk about presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed IGs, like in my position. The setup that Congress created was to allow me to operate without fear that the agency leadership can respond in a personnel action against me. I can, of course, be removed at will by the president, and that's entirely appropriate, and none of this legislation changes that.
Okay, so again, it's independent of the agencies,
Right.
but Inspector Generals report to the president. They serve at his pleasure, correct?
That's correct.
Unfortunately, over the years, and I've experienced this firsthand as chairman of this committee, trying to undertake investigations, issuing subpoenas, for example, to the FBI, that were largely ignored, slow-walked. You know, congressional oversight has been dramatically weakened because we have no enforcement mechanisms. So it seems like we've outsourced our oversight, the people's oversight, the people's direct oversight into these agencies to Inspector Generals. And I am concerned that Inspector Generals, when they take a look at that independent moniker, they're thinking that's independent of everybody. The President of the United States is held accountable to the voters. If he dismisses an Inspector General, the voters will hold the President accountable. So I am concerned about the thrust of, you know, all the requirements imposed by Congress. Again, we've relied on Inspector Generals, and I appreciate the work. I've also worked with Inspector Generals who tried to, that were corrupt and had to leave. Okay, and I think you know, our other witnesses are aware of that as well. The inspections they're having to do on Inspector Generals. So I think this is important to keep in mind, that it's the Inspector Generals report to the President. They don't report to Congress. We use them, but my solution would be to beef up, reclaim congressional oversight power, which we have allowed to lapse, and we've outsourced that to Inspector General. Do you understand that assessment? Not agree or disagree, but do you understand where I'm coming from there?
Well, look, I certainly understand the concern you outline about what the congressional oversight responsibilities are and how they've been executed. I'll just say, this legislation changes nothing about the president's ability to remove an IG. There is no for-cause provision here. There is none of that. And to your point, as SIGI chair, one of the things, and Allison has continued this, I know, as chair, I talk about this all the time with not only my folks at DOJ OIG, but with other IGs. We're not free-range actors. I agree with you completely. We are in a constitutional system. We follow the IG Act. We follow the law. What I think the legislation does, though, particularly with the Vacancies Act, is it doesn't limit the president's ability to remove. The president can remove whomever the president wants.
Just puts reporting requirements on them.
It does, well, on the...
So again, I've got some other issues. So
Okay.
One example, I think a glaring example in terms of the weakening of congressional oversight is, for example, under a FOIA request, over 4,000 of Dr. Fauci's emails were provided to an outside group. Now, Congress is not subject to the redactions of that information that, again, they were forced to give to an outside group. We asked for those, 5 of us, on this committee, using the law that says the agency shall turn over this information. We were asking for new documents. We were just asking for the 4,000 pages unredacted. We haven't gotten them unredacted. We're getting them now in dribs and drab, you know, just little bits and pieces, you know, a couple pages at a time, in camera. I think that's wrong. I do want to, before I run out of time here, though, because I haven't been able to talk to you about this since I was chair and since you issued your FISA report. In your FISA report, you talked about how, and this was in the main body of the report, how Bill Priestap had told you, quote, that the FBI didn't have any indication whatsoever by May 2017 that Russians were running a disinformation campaign through the Steele election reporting. And that was in your FISA report, correct?
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but
Okay.
I trust your.
It was. It took us months and a battle to unredact redacted footnotes that completely are contrary to that. And I don't want to take time to quote that, but that's in the public record, and you're aware of these footnotes.
Yep.
The question I have for you is, I see nothing in these footnotes that should have been classified or even subject to redaction. Why were those redacted?
So I'd have to go back and look at the specific footnotes, and I'm working on memory, but just on this and all our other reports, we send this to the FBI and the Justice Department leadership, and they ultimately make the call, and I am not the person who's going to put out information they say is classified, obviously, and risk getting prosecuted for doing that.
So again, what I was trying to point out here, this was further cover-up by the FBI and the Department of Justice wanting to make sure that it wasn't in the public domain very early on. They knew that people that were sourced to the Steele dossier had contacts with Russian intelligence services. They knew this as early as October 2016 and January 2016, and yet the FBI and the Mueller investigation continued to plod forward and put this country through the political turmoil of the Mueller investigation, even though they knew the source document that prompted the investigation, the corrupt investigation, was very likely a product, or certainly part of a product, of Russian disinformation. That's an accurate assessment, isn't it?
Well, I'll just add, there are many reasons why, as we detail in the report, there should have been greater follow-up and skepticism about reporting. So I
will say every step of the way in my investigation, I was frustrated by members of this committee, but by FBI Director Wray that did not comply with my subpoenas. And as a result, the American public was kept in the dark about this. I think, and my final point is, congressional oversight capability must be beefed up. As important as IG reforms are and making sure that you can operate independently and uncover corruption within agencies to report to the president, Congress needs the oversight ability to report to the American public.
And
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
And can I just
Quickly,
on
please.
the Senator's point, because I do think it's relevant to today's discussion as well, because as many of the members know who were here over the last 10 years, certainly in my first few years, and Senator Johnson chaired, I think, some of these hearings where we talked about my inability to get records. And at the time, just to be clear, one of the area that was off limits to me, supposedly, was FISA records back in the day, as you'll recall. The only reason that changed is because this committee, Senator Grassley, and the House moved the IG Empowerment Act legislation in 2016 that overturned the OLC opinion, the FBI's position, and gave us access to that. If we didn't have the access to the records, you wouldn't have even had our 600-page report about FISA, because I couldn't have done it. And that's why the reforms here are so important for us to be able to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Senator Hassan, for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. And I want to thank our witnesses not only for your testimony, but for your service as Inspectors General. It's obviously incredibly important, and I'm very, very grateful to you and your families for the service you provide. Your important work roots out waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars and improves the delivery of critical services to the American people. I want to start with a question to you, Inspector General Lerner. And I'd really like to follow up on the need for the testimonial subpoena authority, because for more than 40 years, inspectors general have been able to issue subpoenas to compel the production of documents to advance their oversight work. Earlier this year, I introduced the Inspector General Testimonial Subpoena Authority Act with Senator Grassley to expand the subpoena authority and allow the IG community to also compel in-person testimony from witnesses who refuse to cooperate with IG investigations. And we've talked a little bit about that already this morning. But Inspector General Lerner, how do Inspectors General use the documentary subpoena authority, and how would having the testimonial subpoena authority build on the existing authority?
First off, thank you very much for your and Senator Grassley's support for testimonial subpoena authority. In terms of how IGs use documentary subpoena authority, I think they've used it very successfully over the over 40 years that we've had that authority. As I indicated earlier, most IGs have a strong process built around ensuring the appropriateness of the subpoenas that are being put out, ensuring that they are within the jurisdiction of the office and that they are not overly broad or unduly burdensome. We know in asking people to provide us with documents that that is a burden on them, but it needs, it needs to be outweighed by the benefit that's coming in. And I think we've, as court cases have shown, in situations where IGs have issued subpoenas, there have been very, very few cases where an IG subpoena has not been upheld. I can think of one, and that was a situation where the subpoena was not related to a matter within the IG's jurisdiction. But so I think we've got an outstandingly strong process of appropriately using our documentary subpoena, and we're able to build on that and ensure that we appropriately handle testimonial subpoena authority.
So you've got a system in place, and you can use the same kind of parameters and structures and reviews to oversee the documentary subpoena process so it wouldn't be abused.
Absolutely. We will build on them because obviously what we're asking for here, it takes us a step beyond documentary, right, and it has a greater impact on people.
Right. And you referenced it just a bit, but if concerns are raised about an IG's use of the documentary subpoena authority, how are those concerns addressed?
There are a couple of different avenues. If there's any question of, political or partisan or problematic reasons behind a subpoena, that's a matter that could go to SIGI's Integrity Committee. But I also imagine if we're given this authority, we would build steps into our peer review process to examine the use of this by inspectors general, ensure that they have appropriate procedures in place, and factor that into the ultimate assessment that happens periodically of all IG's investigative operations.
Well, thank you.
Can I add, Senator?
Yes, just briefly, because we've got to get to a bunch of other things.
Absolutely. The other mechanism is, frankly, if someone receives a subpoena and thinks it's improper, they can go to court.
Right.
It can't be, we can't enforce it. We'd have to go to court and get a judge to do it.
Got it. I appreciate that. Yeah. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper on something that you mentioned, Ms. Lerner, and I'll actually ask Inspector General Horowitz and Winters to reply to this. It's important to note that testimonial authority, subpoena authority isn't new, because the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General has had the testimonial subpoena authority for more than a decade. So, IG Horowitz, you mentioned in your testimony that the Department of Defense IG has used its testimonial subpoena authority sparingly, issuing only 3 subpoenas for testimony since it received the authority in 2009. How can the DoD IG's use of this authority serve as a model for how other IGs can use the testimonial subpoena authority in a judicious and thoughtful way?
It's an excellent question. I think it is very important for us to use it as a model because it has worked so well for now a dozen years. And what I would expect to happen, as I understand is happening and has happened at the Defense Department IG, is before an IG signs a subpoena for testimony, they engage counsel or the witness themselves to understand what the concerns are, if there are any issues that are or problems with testimony. Frankly, we do that now with the voluntary arena. When we're trying to get people to speak to us voluntarily, we have those discussions. You do the same thing, and what I understand from the Defense Department IG is the reason they've had to issue so few is they've been able to reach accommodations with witnesses that have avoided the need to issue the subpoena and define the parameters of an acceptable voluntary interview.
Excellent. And I just wanted to confirm, Inspector General Winters, you mentioned it earlier, that your integrity committee of SIGI can prevent abuse of the testimonial subpoena authority as well.
That's correct. Abuse of authority is squarely within our jurisdictional realm.
Okay. To Inspector General Lerner, I appreciated your testimony regarding my work to reform the semi-annual reports to Congress. These reforms intend to streamline and simplify the semi-annual reports to make them more accessible to Congress and the public, and to place greater emphasis on the agency's response to IG recommendations to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. How would these reforms help the Inspector General community, and are you confident that agencies and Congress will still receive the important oversight information that these reports are intended to provide?
I am absolutely confident that these reforms would not interfere with the transparency that Congress deserves from inspectors general. In the 40 years since those requirements were enacted, IGs have made tremendous gains in being transparent. We all have websites now. We have places like oversight.gov. These reforms will allow us to more efficiently produce the semi-annual reports and leverage those existing resources. And that will ensure that the most important matters are most clearly visible and transparent, and that the time and energy we used to put into doing things that were of lesser interest can be redirected and produce better outcomes for our office and for the people who depend on our work.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair, and again to all of the witnesses, thank you for your work.
Thank you, Senator Hessen. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your question.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you all for your work. It's vitally important. We very much appreciate the work and would encourage you to stay on it, continue to bring ideas and issues. The Inspectors General deals with waste, deals with fraud, makes recommendations, brings up ideas of greater efficiency. So Inspectors General that are actually leaning in to an agency, developing those relationships and proposing ideas helps us all. And helps the nation. There is an expectation of that work. And let me just be one of many to be able to say to you, lean in. We need you working well in that task on it. I've got a whole litany of issues and questions that I want to be able to walk through and try to be able to address. We've talked through several things, but I would tell you what I hear most from people at home when they talk about Inspectors General and different issues they see in government is, why does it seem like no one's held to account? Now, we all know that's not correct. There are some people held to account, but it becomes a very big deal when we see someone like Andrew McCabe, who you've already mentioned earlier, who you found, researched, walked through all the interviews, and found that he clearly lied, was fired by the Department of Justice, and then now has been added back in. His pension's now recovered. Back pay is being paid back to him. There's a real sense of, hey, there was an Inspector General report that came out saying this person lied, and there seems to be no consequence on it. So what we can do to be able to bring you testimonial subpoena authority and to be able to get at some of these things and to get recommendations is of great benefit to just restoring trust into government in the process. So I'm going to drill down on a couple of these. Mr. Horowitz, you've been through investigations before that cross jurisdiction. You walked through the issue of Glenn Simpson and Jonathan Winter. It's a State Department issue where you're over on Department of Justice, their State Department, then they retire and make this even harder. So can we talk through when you get into an investigation that may include people from multiple quote-unquote jurisdictions from other agencies, and then when they retire, how hard that is to be able to get the testimonial evidence?
It's very hard, and the normal process would be if the employee was still at the State Department, for example, I'd reach out to the state IG, and they would facilitate my being able to speak to that person, much as I do actually on occasions when people call me. But once the employee's gone, the employee's gone. And I have no authority over them. State Department employee doesn't. The only one would is the Defense Department IG, and I obviously don't cross over into that realm much.
So subpoena power to be able to require testimonies is essential for just the ongoing work, because there are numerous examples of individuals who were under investigation for the Inspector General. They just retired and said, I'm out. And then it becomes the issue of they retire with benefits. Everyone knows that there was activity there was fraud, there was abuse. That was something whistleblowers have called out, but they just retire and leave. They leave with full benefits.
And how do you explain to the complainant who's come in and said I was sexually assaulted, or I was retaliated against as a whistleblower, or I just reported money was stolen and you're doing nothing about it?
Right.
The answer is, well, you know, we need to get the evidence.
So we need to get that to you, clearly. There needs to be a balanced perspective on how that's handled. It was handled judiciously by the Department of Justice over the decade that they've had it. I believe that that can work, but we've got to be able to find a way to be able to hold people to account in the process. Mr. Horowitz, again, for you, you did a very thorough examination on the Woods procedures in the FISA. FISA has been an area that you've been excluded from, obviously be able to take a look at when you're having the opportunity to be able to do it. You're just looking to see whether the standards that have been set for a FISA application process were followed. That's a pretty straightforward issue. Best that I had when I pulled through this, you sampled 29 FISA applications and you found 400 instances of noncompliance with the Woods procedures. Then it got worse. You went through 7,000 FISA applications that have been authorized in the last 5 years. There were 179 which the Woods file, as was listed from your document, was missing, destroyed, or incomplete. I want to drill down on a couple of those things. Missing and incomplete is one thing. Destroyed is something totally different. That is a volitional act. Do you have evidence that some of these Woods procedures were destroyed?
We have evidence that some of the files were destroyed. The problem was the FBI, even though they put in place this requirement of creating a Woods file, didn't give any guidance on what you should do with it afterwards. We had a situation where our investigators, lawyers went in and found a stack of documents in a corner, and that was we were told was what comprised the Woods file. So you can't have a effective procedure to try and make sure FISA is scrupulously accurate through a Woods procedure and then not ensure the Woods procedures are being followed. Right.
You made 10 recommendations to the FBI. 5 of them they've responded to. 5 of them, best of our understanding, they have not. Do you have an update from them that they're following through on those recommendations?
They have told us they are following through on them, and through our regular process, in 60 days to 90 days, they will owe us a report, and we will continue to update that. We've been doing this, by the way, in some of our other national security reports with the FBI for years and years because we continue to follow up. That's what it means to have independent oversight. We close them, not the agency.
Right. Mr. Winters, I want to be able to drill down on something here. The allegations that come to anyone, to the Inspector General, from a whistleblower, whoever it may be, sometimes they're factual, sometimes they are not. Sometimes it is harassment from an employee that has found an effective way to be able to harass individuals and to keep them tied up into investigations. So the Inspector General has a process for determining whether an allegation has merit at the beginning. I call it like a little mini grand jury. You can call it what you want to at that point, but you've got to be able to make a decision to have merit. Can you walk me through that process? Because sometimes this is a legitimate investigation, sometimes it's harassment. How do you evaluate this, and what do you pass on to other Inspector Generals?
Senator. And every Inspector General faces that, and also the Integrity Committee as well, in terms of
Correct.
The weaponization of complaints. And but we have a process for it, and particularly in the pandemic, we have a lot of complaints coming in. So there's a sifting, and when we look at basically, is this a valid complaint that alleges some form of wrongdoing that's actionable? And from the Integrity Committee's perspective, whether or not there's a person that's covered in that's basically a senior level person. For a typical complaint that comes in from, say, for example, to NASA when I was there, or Amtrak, we have a specific section that does that has a sifting process that assesses the facts versus the criteria of whether something's actionable or not.
So we obviously want to be able to get you, and we've been very outspoken on this, the testimonial subpoena power, to be able to make sure someone can't just retire and then just avoid any kind of pursuit on this. We've talked a lot about trying to get to who is the chain of succession if we need to get to an acting Inspector General. We've spoken frequently about how to be able to get more Inspectors General. This has been an issue of multiple presidents, that they just don't appoint an Inspector General, so they leave it open for a long time, and it becomes an issue. This seems to be a gap that I just don't know enough about, and I'd be willing to be able to talk about, because I never want the Inspectors General office to be used as a weapon against somebody unjustly, because especially if someone's in their personal capacity and is having to hire their own personal attorney in this process, and someone who's just mad at them for a decision that they made chooses to be able to weaponize the process, that becomes highly destructive to them personally and discourages people from actually stepping into government when they know there is a federal employee that can weaponize this process and just drive them out.
I absolutely agree with that. As an Inspector General, and I can just talk for me personally, we take an oath. I took my first oath in August 1972 to support and defend the Constitution. And what that means is adherence to the rule of law, not some partisan narrative. So we're very sensitive to those type of complaints and endeavor, of course, to follow the law and the facts in terms of those particular complaints.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Langford, thank you. Thank you for your contributions to the legislation and particularly your work on this testimonial subpoena issue, which is a difficult one to navigate, but a very important one. So thanks for your help. We have a number of people who are on virtually. Senator Ossoff, I believe you are next, if you're with us.
Thank you, Senator Portman,
Great.
and thank you to the Inspectors General for your service, your diligent work for joining us today. Appreciate this discussion of the legislation pending before the committee. I also want to drill down on a couple of specific issues within your respective areas of responsibility that you've identified as possible targets for reform legislation or change of practice in the executive branch. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for your collaboration and communication with my office as we've developed bipartisan legislation to reform the security camera systems in Bureau of Prisons facilities. I'd note that that legislation passed the Senate last night. You have also made recommendations with respect to single cell confinement for incarcerated persons with mental illness and recommendations with respect to pharmaceutical purchases by BOP facilities and costs of outside medical care. Could you briefly outline those recommendations to the committee?
Certainly, Senator, and I also noted that the bill passed last night that will, I think, have a potentially important impact on the prison camera system. So with regard to single selling of inmates, we identified significant concerns with how it impacted individuals' mental health at the BOP, the BOP's policies for how to deal with inmates who were disruptive. This is what it involved. It involved individuals who were disruptive and who the BOP put in special housing units and in some instances single-celled them. And that is something the BOP says it does not look to do, that it does not put individuals in solitary confinement, yet we identified numerous instances where that occurred. So we made a variety of recommendations that the BOP agreed with. As I sit here today, Senator, I don't know the status of those, but I can certainly follow up with you on that. On the pharmaceutical side and the cost side, we've issued a number of reports identifying how the BOP has not taken the steps it could take to reduce some of its costs so that it could save money in various areas that it's spending, particularly on the pharmaceutical side. And so, for instance, what we found is that there are 4 agencies that receive what's called the Big Four pricing, which is favorable pricing on pharmaceuticals, but that the BOP, even though it has one of the largest healthcare systems, if you will, because it has to take care of the 150,000 or so federal inmates, doesn't get that preferred pricing. And so we also made the recommendation to the department that it consider coming to Congress to seek legislation to also be able to obtain that favorable pricing, which could save tens of millions of dollars for the BOP.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. There's been some discussion at today's hearing about testimonial subpoena power and the ability to compel testimony from personnel who retire amidst or in advance of an investigation. Could you also comment, Mr. Horowitz, on some of the other issues related to retirement of federal personnel amidst investigation, how that can interrupt or terminate the investigative process, and the implications for their personnel records when they may seek employment once again in the same or another federal agency?
Absolutely, Senator. It's an issue that we've been very concerned about for years. In fact, we issued a report about this about 3 weeks ago concerning specifically how the FBI was handling adjudications of employees who had retired or resigned during the course of the investigations. So the way the process goes is we investigate, or the FBI investigates misconduct. It completes its work and sends it to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility for adjudication. which is to determine what penalty or discipline to impose. And what we found is that the FBI regularly, with limited exception, closes its adjudication if an employee resigns or retires. And we found in 2017 and 2018 that that occurred in more than 10% of the cases. That's concerning because, as you indicated, what happens is, in many instances, employees resign or retire and then either get hired as contractors because they're working for a contracting office, or go to another government agency to work, or in the law enforcement case, might go to state and local law enforcement. And so it's important that the FBI and other Justice Department agencies, and frankly across the entire federal government, that when individuals leave who have engaged in wrongdoing or misconduct, that those matters get adjudicated and that the findings be included in their personnel files. And I'll add, it also is important in the case where the individuals are found not to have committed misconduct because, by the way, in those more than 10% of the cases I mentioned, in some of them, the OIG had actually found that the individual didn't engage in the misconduct, yet they weren't cleared because, formally and fully cleared, because the matter wasn't adjudicated.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Winters, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that passed the Senate earlier this year included some significant investment in passenger rail. I'm a strong advocate for expanding passenger rail capacity in the United States, and particularly in the Southeast, to connect, for example, Atlanta, Macon, Savannah, Atlanta, Charlotte, Atlanta, Nashville, and additional commuter rail options for rural and suburban and urban communities across the state of Georgia. You've made recommendations and I think alarming observations with respect to the cybersecurity of Amtrak's train control systems. Could you please detail in my remaining time those observations and recommendations for the committee?
Well, in this public setting, Senator, I can't go into a lot of detail on it, and I would be happy to meet with you privately regarding some of those the particular details on that. I'll say this, that Amtrak is not alone, in terms of having challenges with cybersecurity. Train control systems, of course, are critical to the safety of passenger rail, and our office conducts very aggressive oversight in that space.
Thank you, Mr. Winters. My staff will reach out to yours to set up a classified forum to get into more detail on that. Thank you again for all of your service and your diligent work, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Scott.
First, I want to thank Senator Portman for hosting this this hearing. And I want to thank each of you for doing what you do. I've been up here 2 years and 9 months, and I've really appreciated the IGs because I believe the oversight function of this committee in Congress is really important. I'm a business guy. I liked internal audit. Not sure everybody liked it, but I thought it was always helpful to make sure we knew exactly what was going on. One of the questions I have is how important is this subpoena power, and is it necessary? And if each of you could sort of address if you've seen situations where an IG investigation has been hindered, obstructed, halted because they're not able to compel a person to submit to questioning. So if you could start with Mr. Horowitz.
Absolutely. Good to see you again, Senator.
Yeah.
And thank you for the question.
And thanks for what you guys do, by the way. I'm appreciative of it.
Yeah, no, and obviously, as you well know, and as I know, the state of Florida has the largest IG system in the country, and a very impressive one. And we've worked with the.
They were really helpful if you're the governor.
Yeah, and we've worked with the IGs there and been very helpful to us on the federal level.
Yeah.
So on the testimonial subpoena authority, I can highlight high-profile matters like our NASA investigation, where the USA Gymnastics president refused a second interview with us so we could ask about allegations involving the FBI special agent in charge and whether there was a conflict of interest. In the FISA review, we couldn't reach certain State Department employees who had left, as well as others who were never government employees but had highly relevant information. I could go back all the way to Fast and Furious, where the U.S. attorney quit rather than speaking, or quit and then wouldn't speak to us. But most importantly, I think it's in the routine, day-to-day ones that don't get those kinds of attention, that as you know, we do all the time, like whistleblower retaliation investigations. I have authority over FBI whistleblower retaliation. It happens there where people resign or retire, and I can't talk to key witnesses. It happens with contractors who are alleged to have stolen money.
I was going to ask you about that.
Right?
So.
Contractors, stolen money. Congress gave us authority to do that kind of work, right? Precisely because of your concern and making sure we could oversee allegations of theft and wrongdoing. Well, if we can't subpoena non-government employees, right, we have no ability, even if they work at the contractor, I can't compel them to talk to me. I can compel a DOJ employee. I can't compel one of their contractors. And if they leave the contractor, it's even harder to get that person to agree to speak with us. Sexual harassment cases, I could detail multiple ones where the employee left rather than speak to me.
So you just couldn't pursue it.
I have no authority to do it.
No information, I guess.
I have the information, the allegation. So yeah, are there times I can confirm it? Absolutely, through other mechanisms. But it takes us longer. Just, in several of our investigations, by the way, like the FISA one, the Clinton email one, and others, people did speak to us voluntarily, but they waited till very late to speak to us. And so it delays our work. So even in those instances where you see us actually hearing from people, it could take us a lot of time to get them to speak to us. And so it's a very important tool. I very much appreciate, as I mentioned, that the committee has built in place protections because there should be safeguards. It shouldn't be something we just run around and are able to use. There's 3 IGs who are going to have to review it. I'm going to have to review it as the IG at Justice. I'm going to give it scrutiny. It's not going to go on to the 3 IGs unless I've put a lot of oversight and look into it. So I think it's a critical tool for us. And frankly, for the public, they want to know what happened.
Right.
They don't want to know that someone stiffed us and we couldn't figure it out, or I think this is what happened, but I can't definitively know because I can't get the evidence.
Right. Mr. Winters?
Yeah. Senator, one thing I have learned is after serving at NASA for 9 years, running their investigations, now at Amtrak and now on the Integrity Committee, is we carefully decide whether or not to investigate a matter. There's a reason that we're doing that. It's not just some whim, that there's a real public interest in finding out the truth. And how frustrating it was in those 9 years at NASA and at Amtrak and now at the Integrity Committee that we can't really get to the truth because we don't have the tools to do that. So we appreciate your help in that regard.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what Kevin said. It's one of the most frustrating things for my investigative staff when we have an allegation. We had a situation once, we were looking into a small business that had allegedly defrauded NSF, and we were told by one of the employees that he had fabricated the timesheets that we were given to support time. And that ended the voluntary cooperation from all of the people at the recipient. And so we were unable, we had the documentary evidence, but we weren't able to engage with the people that could give us greater insights and take that case to closure. It's extremely demoralizing for our investigative staff when those matters come. So there are so many benefits that would come from this authority. And some are internal to our own offices.
And you think there's enough safeguards that it won't get abused?
Yeah, I think the safeguards you've added are very important. Yeah. That is clearly a very reasonable, legitimate concern. There's going to be a 3-IG panel. The IGs are going to have to improve these personally. There's the Integrity Committee. If people are abusing it, they're available. And these are not self-enforcing subpoenas. If a recipient thinks we're abusing the authority, they can go to court. And we're going to have to convince the Justice Department Civil Division. We don't have litigating authority. So we have to tell the Justice Department Civil Division, defend this subpoena. So there's that layer of protection as well. So you have to convince me. You then have to convince 3 IGs. If a recipient thinks we're doing something wrong and they want to go to court, I have to convince the Civil Division at the Justice Department, and then they have to convince a judge.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I do think that's the case. And I'll just add, Senator, that the Defense Department IGs had this authority for 12 years now. They've used it very rarely, handful of cases. They've not, to my understanding, lost a case that way.
Right.
You've given it to me as the chair of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. We're overseeing $5 trillion. And you gave it previously to the Recovery Act in 2009. In none of those instances has it been abused. So I think there's a track record as well, which is why I'm concerned, and we talked about the sunset issue earlier. I think that track record with those protections on top of the concerns that IG Lerner mentioned earlier, I think should hopefully give comfort to people that this will be used appropriately. We're also going to notify the Attorney General, by the way.
Right. And can I just build on what you said? The bottom line is all of us IGs who are going to be the ones signing those authorities, we know what's at stake here. It's taken us 10 years, if we're lucky, to get this authority, and we know our use of it is going to be scrutinized. We're going to be hyper-focused on ensuring that we stay on the right side of the law here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Senator Peters.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Padilla, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to also thank each of our witnesses for your testimony and for your public service. As several colleagues have recognized, and I want to associate myself with their comments as well, Inspector Generals play a key role in our democracy by independently and objectively working to expose waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, also acknowledged earlier in the hearing, Congress did pass the Inspector General Act in the wake of the Watergate scandal as a means of ensuring integrity and accountability in the executive branch. And for over 40 years, Congress and the public have relied on the work of Inspectors General to speak truth to power. In recent years, those truths have included, for example, shedding light on the inhumane treatment of immigrants, including children, in federal detention centers and the shortcomings of our COVID pandemic response. However, administrations have exploited some gaps in law and undermined the efficacy of the Inspectors General, and I appreciate the chairman and ranking members calling attention to the issue. Now, as you know, this committee is considering legislation that grants Inspectors General the authority to subpoena witnesses for testimony. At present, most Inspectors General lack the authority to compel testimony from certain categories of individuals, including contractors and former federal employees. So my first question is for Mr. Horowitz. Mr. Horowitz, you highlighted that in numerous investigations, the lack of testimonial subpoena power hampered your work. You referenced in particular the investigation you led regarding the former administration's family separation policy, which resulted in nearly 4,000 family separations. So using that as a great example, not in a good way, how would testimonial subpoena power have aided your investigation of the family separation policy?
Thank you, Senator. And you're right, that is one of the reviews that we've done and investigations that we've done that warrant our ability to have this authority. I think it's fair for us as IGs, when we're looking at a policy implementation, to be able to speak to those who were responsible for the policy. In that particular case, the zero tolerance policy was announced by then Attorney General Sessions. We got broad cooperation from throughout the Justice Department, from employees at the department, and if I recall correctly, from some employees who were no longer at the department. But we couldn't get testimony from former Attorney General Sessions, who was obviously very central to that discussion. And our inability to do that meant that there were certain items, certain issues, certain discussions that he was a part of that we weren't able to get his recollection of events. There were few notes of some of those meetings, and so our inability to do it diminished from our ability to fully assess what had occurred.
Appreciate you sharing that. And I know that on the flip side, there are folks who say, well, any subpoena power can also be abused. Mm-hmm. So the next question is for Ms. Lerner and for Mr. Winters. Do you think that the legislation we're considering has the adequate checks to ensure that the authority is not misused?
I'll start. And certainly I think that requiring notification to the Attorney General and utilizing an IG panel. This is above and beyond what we ordinarily do. We're building on a very strong foundation that we have in place for our use of documentary subpoenas. We will, by adding these additional requirements of consultation with the Attorney General's office and the approval of a 3-person IG panel and stepped-up reporting requirements, I think that the evidence will be there that will clearly incentivize everyone to use this properly. Not that I think that incentive is necessary. As I mentioned earlier, all of us as IGs recognize the stakes if we are granted this authority and are committed to exercising it wisely. But we appreciate your interest in common sense controls to help ensure it's not misused. Kevin?
I agree that those controls are adequate. And I also add that the SIGI's Integrity Committee, which is designed by Congress, is another check on abusing that authority.
Yeah.
Great. I appreciate that. One more question in the time remaining, also for Ms. Lerner and Mr. Winters, but I will sort of tee up the question. Ensuring that government agencies maintain a strong cybersecurity posture has never been more important. I think we would all agree to that. Numerous breaches of government and critical infrastructure have inspired a significant push to ensure that our agencies have the resources and the information they need to effectively guard their systems. We also need to be sure that the agencies are complying with existing cybersecurity requirements. So the question again to both of you is, what role do inspectors general play in enhancing the cybersecurity of federal agencies, and how will the reforms that have been discussed today help strengthen that work?
Most inspectors general are required by law to conduct the audits of the agency's information system securities under the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, or FISMA. So you have our independent eyes examining the agency's systems in accordance with criteria that is laid out by the NIST and, I believe, potentially Department of Homeland Security. So you have our independent eyes using independently determined standards, and there's a great deal of value that comes from that. In many instances, there's penetration testing done as part of that process, and so that adds real insight into the strength of individual agencies' information systems. Kevin?
I agree with Ms. Lerner's commentary on those tools. I'll also add that within SIGI, we have a separate committee called the Tech Committee that we share the best practices of oversight of critical infrastructure IT requirements.
Thank you both for your responses, and thank you again for your work. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Peters, Ranking Member Portman, for holding this hearing. You know, this committee really does some great bipartisan work, and I am grateful to both of you to have the opportunity to have this discussion about something really important. As we all know, reforming how inspectors general function in the federal government, it's fundamentally a good government issue. Simply put, IGs make government work better for the American people and ensure agencies are good stewards of taxpayer dollars. Having independent watchdogs ensures that federal agencies carry out their public service missions with integrity and efficiency. I was pleased to see in Ms. Lerner's testimony that the work of the IGs and their staff generated potential taxpayer savings of about $53 billion in FY 2020, a $17 return on every dollar invested in the offices of Inspector General. And I'm going to ask a little bit more about that in a moment. So I really want to thank my colleagues for their serious attention to this issue. Thank each of the witnesses for their public service and commitment to transparency and accountability, not just to the taxpayers in Nevada, but of course across the country. And so I want to speak about the savings to taxpayers from IG oversight. So Ms. Lerner, as I mentioned, I was really interested to read your testimony about the significant taxpayer savings generated by the work of IGs. So can you tell us more about how you track and calculate the savings to taxpayers as a result of the work of the IG offices?
Certainly. All IGs report semi-annually to Congress and on the work of our audit. And included in the tables in the semi-annual reports are the outcomes of our audits and inspections that can yield funds that are questioned as being, dubious expenditures, and also funds that could be put to better use. And there are also financial returns to government that come from our investigative work. When, for example, there are fines, penalties, and restitution that come through criminal cases, or in the case of False Claims Act investigations, potentially treble damages can be returned to the government. The singles going to the agency and the rest going to the Treasury. So there are many ways that our work yields quantifiable financial returns to the government.
Well, I can tell you that a lot of people that are watching today, and a lot of the questions we get is really, how are we spending people's money? And they're worried that we're wasting it. So maybe could you share with us some examples of wasteful spending or other inefficiencies that you've identified from a federal agency? And how do you think then Congress can help in preventing this?
I think that there are so many ways that people can misuse money. Speaking from my own agency's experience, NSF is a large grant-making agency. And what we find sometimes is grant recipients take NSF's money, but they do not ensure that they use it for the purposes for which it was given. We've had instances where people propose doing scientific research and are funded by NSF to do that, but it turns out that they've actually done that scientific research already, and they're going to take our money and use it for other purposes. And so in situations like that, we pursue a grant fraud investigation and work with prosecutors to hold those people to account for their misuse of government funding. There are other situations that don't rise to the level of criminal or civil wrongdoing that involve people who have perhaps misunderstood the rules governing the funding that they're receiving. And in those instances, we question that through an audit process. I think that much of the improvements that are necessary in situations like that reside within the agency, in ensuring that people who receive funding understand their obligations and understand what's expected of them in terms of managing the money. But I'd be happy to consult, to get back to you with more concrete ideas about whether there are mechanisms for Congress as well in that process.
Thank you. I would look forward to that. And the other thing is, I know that you need a lot of help to do these investigations. So I want to talk about recruiting and retaining qualified IGs, because in my view, one of the most important services that the Council of the Inspectors General on Integrity and Efficiency, or CIGE, provides is ensuring that IGs and their staff, well, you're qualified to do your jobs. We've talked a lot today about the importance of IGs who are really making sure that they're truly independent from the president, from agency heads. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you all think about what makes someone qualified to be an IG and how we can ensure a pipeline of talented individuals to fill these jobs. So Ms. Lerner, as chair of CIGE, could you comment how we can improve and build on the pipeline for oversight talent, please?
I think one of the best things that we can do is ensure that people who, who are my daughter's age, I have a daughter in college and one in law school, that they understand the opportunities that are available in the oversight community and see us as viable career paths. We have many people who are going to be aging out of leadership roles, and we've got to ensure that we've got a new generation coming forward that are willing to engage with us. So doing a better job on our part of getting the word out about our mission will help us there. We also in SIGI have a great IG candidate panel that supports both the president and agency heads in seeking to fill IG positions. They look at the experience. Obviously, in the statute, there are certain discipline-related types of expertise that IGs are supposed to have, but you also want to know that someone who's interested in being an IG understands how hard it can be to be independent, how difficult it can be to sit at the top of an organization and where you are part of, but at a distance from your own agency, and also committed to engaging with Congress. And you need to be responsive and respectful to both of those sides of your reporting obligations, but you need to maintain your own integrity in doing your work the way that it's appropriate within the IG Act. So we ask a lot of questions focused on that of people who are interested in being IGs as well.
Thank you. And I see my time is up. So Mr. Horowitz and Mr. Winters, I'll submit the same question to you for the record. And hopefully we can build a good pipeline of qualified, caring people to do this very important job for the United States government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Ranking Member Portman, I know you had some closing questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I won't take the full time. I just want to say that I think this has been a terrific hearing and an exchange of views, and it seems to me that of all the issues we've touched on, probably the one that has had the most potential controversy is the testimonial subpoenas. And I appreciate your initial response, Ms. Lerner, to my questions and to Chairman Peters' questions on that. I think it's important to lay out what the guardrails are, because we've talked a lot about guardrails without getting into detail, and I do think there's some safeguards here that Senator Peters and I have included in our bill that are quite effective, because I do think that it's an enormous responsibility that the IGs would be taking on to subpoena people after they leave. Number one, the Attorney General would review any subpoena going out and would be able, in that case, as I understand it, to provide information as to any potential conflicts with other investigations that might be ongoing. I think that's important. That information could be considered by this panel. It's a panel of IGs. 3 Senate-confirmed IGs would have to approve it. The SIGI chair is responsible for randomly selecting those 3 Senate-confirmed IGs to review it. Third, it would only be available for audits, evaluations, inspections, and investigations that the IG was undertaking, and so not some fishing expedition, and also would have to be reasonably related to that case. Fourth, SIGI was being asked to issue standards, which they have done before in other areas, and those standards, I think, would be consistent with standards we've laid out before, including that it be reasonably related. And fifth, there'd be a congressional reporting requirement. Now, these are semi-annual reports to Congress, so it's not a report prior to the issuance, but it is a report to Congress to let us know, how it's working and what's going on. And Ms. Lerner, you talked about that earlier as maybe a potential way for Congress to be able to understand without having a sunset put into the legislation itself. Finally, I would just say, and Mr. Horowitz, you mentioned this earlier this morning, that people would still have access to the courts with regard to these subpoenas. So anyway, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you letting me do that. I think our bill is balanced. I think it's a, it's a good way to ensure the independence of IGs, but also ensure that these investigations can continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. I agree, and look forward to moving it forward.
Senator,
Senator,
can I just comment briefly on that?
Absolutely.
That's okay. Because I just want to expand on one of the items you mentioned, which is AG review, and as the Justice Department IG, and I've now been IG under 5 different attorneys general. That has meaning, even though it's not a veto, for example. I should just note, we as IGs in our law enforcement responsibilities and our investigative responsibilities work regularly with the Justice Department, prosecutors, and leadership. The fact that the Attorney General would come into one of the IGs who wanted to issue a subpoena and say, if you issue that subpoena, it could cause us a problem with an ongoing criminal investigation, civil matter, or national security matter, which would probably be a rare instance, but the former might be. I can't imagine a scenario where we wouldn't say, we're not looking to interfere with anything that you're doing in terms of a criminal or civil case. So I think that's actually a very important process, and I appreciate you mentioning that, Senator, because I think that's is of great significance.
Thank you. Senator Hawley, recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for waiting for me, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today. It's good to see all of you. Ms. Lerner, I want to start with you, if I could. Are you familiar with the report from WilmerHale, their independent investigation regarding allegations of misconduct by 3 DHS OIG employees regarding the nomination of Dr. Kafari?
I'm aware of the report.
Have you read it?
A very heavily redacted version.
So my office has been contacted by multiple whistleblowers who allege widespread misconduct, including, I'm afraid, you. And I want to give you the chance to respond to those. I always take whistleblower complaints very seriously. And they pointed me to the WilmerHale report, which I've now read, which I have to say is very, very disturbing. I mean, for those who don't know, it's 108 pages here, 70 interviews conducted, 42,000 documents reviewed. And what WilmerHale found is that a number of DHS OIG employees improperly interfered in the presidential nomination and Senate confirmation process regarding Dr. Kafari to be the IG at DHS. WilmerHale notes at the outset of their investigation, or the outset of their report rather, that of course any citizen has the right to question a presidential nomination in their personal capacity. Federal employees in their capacity as private citizens have a First Amendment right to express their political opinions and may contact lawmakers to do so. And of course, that's very important. They go on, however, it is a misuse of authority for a federal employee to use his or her public office to interfere with a presidential nomination or the Senate confirmation process. And then they say federal employees should not use their government resources, including the email system or access to lawmakers or other government officials, for personal gain or for any other unauthorized purposes. WilmerHale further reports in their investigation, following their investigation, that these individuals who were opposed to Dr. Kafari's nomination within DHS OIG came to you, Ms. Lerner, to discuss the nomination. They wrote to you saying that they had a sensitive matter related to the DHS IG nominee to discuss. You all agreed to speak on the phone, and following the conversation, Ms. Costello, one of the complainants, sent you a link to a report regarding California Coast University. I guess the complaint here was Dr. Kafari's PhD was not from a suitably prestigious university. During the interview, Ms. Costello spoke to Ms. Lerner about Dr. Kafari's nomination, stated they were doing so because it was in the best interest of the agency. Ms. Lerner agreed that they had an obligation to protect the organization and figure out whether others knew that Dr. Kafari's degree was issued by a diploma mill. So what WilmerHale has found here is that you encouraged, you were on government property at the time using government resources on government time, that you encouraged what WilmerHale concludes was a serious interference with the presidential nomination process and the Senate confirmation process, and a pretty serious misuse of government resources. I know you didn't sit for an interview. WilmerHale said they tried to interview you. You wouldn't sit for an interview, but we have you here. These are serious allegations. I thought I'd give you a chance to respond.
I appreciate you giving me the chance.
I'm not sure your mic is on.
Sorry. Appreciate you giving me that opportunity. The most that I could say right now is that the statement of the conversation is not consistent with my recollection of it.
So you deny that you encouraged them to spread around complaints using government resources, that Dr. Kafari was unqualified for the position, that his degree was issued by a diploma mill?
Senator, may I jump in for a second?
Oh, I'd like an answer to my question.
I did not encourage, I did not take the actions as described in the statement made by Ms. Costello.
Did you improperly use government resources to interfere with the presidential nomination, the Senate confirmation process?
I did not.
Did you use any government resources, email, telephone, government property? Did you work on this project in government time?
In my capacity as vice chair, and Michael can speak to this as well in his capacity as chair, we would frequently be called by individuals working in OIG offices who had questions or concerns that they thought that we could shed light on. And we would endeavor to, help to answer those questions. So if, when we take calls from people who have a concern and try to steer them in the right direction. And that's all that I did here with these individuals. And you know, I think that's consistent with our obligation as leaders of SIGI. And, you know, at no point was I trying to undermine the nomination of anyone for a PAS position.
Why didn't SIGI open an investigation into these allegations? Why did Wilmer Hale, why did there have to be an outside investigation which found evidence of wrongdoing?
That's a question best directed to the Integrity Committee because
But it was partly your decision, wasn't it, not to open an investigation?
No, I'm not a member of the Integrity Committee, and the leadership of SIGI is purposefully separate from the Integrity Committee to preserve its independence to conduct investigations of OIG folks.
So when the report says that it's a misuse of authority for a federal employee to use his or her office to interfere with the nomination or confirmation process, and that federal employees should not use their government resources, including email systems or access to lawmakers or other government officials for any unauthorized purpose, you're saying definitively for the record under oath you did never do any of those things?
I did not, you know, undermine anyone's nomination for a PAS position.
You didn't use the email system, access to lawmakers, or any other government resources for any unauthorized purpose?
I used the email systems to respond to questions from individuals about their, you know, a situation in their office, and to attempt to steer them in the right direction, and provide guidance to them as they confronted a challenge. That is not, in my view, inconsistent with my obligations as a public servant.
Well, I'm disappointed that we're here and that this is, frankly, it's come to this impasse that we have this report from Wilmer Hale that is quite extensive and quite lengthy. You didn't sit for an interview with them. They weren't able to get your views on any of this. I noticed neither did you, Mr. Horowitz. I frankly think it's very disappointing. And I think the fact that we now have multiple whistleblowers coming to us about this series of events, I mean, this is harrowing reading, to be honest with you. And it's disturbing reading that this would be happening. And I just want to say I'm going to try to get to the bottom of it. But I'm disappointed that it's come to this and in this setting.
I appreciate your concern, but I would say that Mr. Horowitz and I engaged with people on both sides of that situation who had concerns and wanted to protect both the privacy of both of the entities that we were involving, and so that people would feel comfortable coming to us for counseling in situations like that.
Senator, let me respond to that, because the serious issue, Joe Kafari, by the way, used to work in the DOJ OIG, as you may know, was an agent. I talked with Joe both while his confirmation was pending and after he became IG, and he can explain to you however much he would like. I'd be happy for him to do that, how much time I spent with him, as did Allison on several of those calls, to help him as the IG to get settled in and to deal with some of the challenges he was dealing with. In terms of that, I also talked to him actually on, as he can describe to you, and if you'd like, and I think it may be even in that report, when he wanted to move forward and sought to move forward with the allegations and how to deal with them. With regard to Wilmer Hale's reach out to us, and to me in particular, we engaged with the lawyers and asked them to give us some idea of what they were looking to speak to us about. As Ms. Lerner just indicated, as SIGI chair and as vice chair, I regularly receive calls from IGs, from others in the IG community to give them advice, guidance, views on how they can proceed. Some of it was as routine as career advice. Some of it was far more significant. And the question I had for Wilmer Hale lawyers was what information generally in the areas they were looking at and to get at, because we do have an obligation to ensure that discussions we have, like I had with Mr. Kafari, are maintained in confidence when the individual who comes to us would like them to be in confidence, and then assess whether there's a need for the investigators to have that information. I've got to understand a little bit more before I just sit for an interview as SIGI chair and be asked about a variety of conversations that I've had with people who come to me. And I frankly view it akin as to the IG Act provisions that are in the law that as DOJ IG, let me put it this way, as DOJ IG, if those individuals had come to me, there's an IG Act provision that requires confidentiality. So I've got to think long and hard about that before making a decision on what to speak to. I never ruled it out, but the question was until the end, until there was an unwillingness to have that discussion. But that was my concern, is that we didn't have a dialogue, and I wasn't comfortable at the time knowing what I was to speak to because, frankly, I didn't have firsthand knowledge of a lot of what I ultimately ended up reading about in the WilmerHale report at the time they reached out to me. I was not familiar with
my time is long expired here, and the chairman's been very indulgent. I'll have some additional follow-up questions for you for the record. I can't adjudicate your dispute with WilmerHale as to why you did or didn't sit for an interview. I'm just noting the fact that they say that you had relevant information. In particular, you, Ms. Lerner, had likely had information about these discussions, would have been able to shed light. You didn't sit for an interview. That's your prerogative. But this is, the fact is, this is serious. This is serious, what I read in this report. I hope this isn't normal. It sure as heck shouldn't be. And I think we've got some more work to do to get answers here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator, I'm happy to come meet with you and talk to you in person on this.
Yeah.
Mr. Winters, did you have anything to add? I understand you wanted to know.
Mr. Horowitz's recollection of the back and forth with WilmerHale Council, yes, is accurate, and I share his willingness to come and engage with you more on this.
Right. Thank you, Senator Hawley. And I want to thank again our witnesses for joining us here today, and for our committee members for engaging in this critical issue. We have an opportunity before us to advance some of the most significant reforms to strengthen independent Inspector General oversight in a decade. The legislation that Senator Portman and I have been working on has strong bipartisan as well as bicameral support, and I'm grateful for the leadership of colleagues like Senator Grassley and Senator Hassan, who have long championed independent oversight, as well as the work of Chairwoman Maloney, who is leading this reform effort over in the House. The bipartisan legislation pending before our committee would take important steps to protect the IG from undue interference and ensure that they have the tools to conduct effective oversight for American taxpayers. Many of the provisions included in the bill have received strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate in recent years, and I hope to build on that momentum with the legislation that will be before us shortly. I appreciate my colleagues' diligence on this important issue, and I look forward to continuing to work together to harness the opportunity before us to pass these bipartisan reforms and strengthen the roles of our nation's independent watchdogs. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on November 5th, 2021 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.